right, we have Congressman John Moolenaar discussing his most recent votes on the budget for the fiscal year and why he did what he did. So thank you, John, for taking time away to explain.
To Mount Pleasant tomorrow and then back to DC on Monday. But I wanted to make sure we got some time together, and I appreciate the chance to talk with you. I know some are concerned about the appropriations process, and I'd love to talk with you about that. I also just want to update you on the work I'm doing with respect to the new select committee on the strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party. I've been serving on that committee. I was just recently announced that I'll be chairing that committee, and I'm very excited to do that. This is a really important time for our country. We've got to reset the relationship with China. For the last 30 years, kind of the hope was that China would become more democratic, more free market oriented, more of a responsible country in the world, and instead they've gone the other direction. They've been more aggressive at home and abroad, and really trying to influence our national defense, our economy. The human rights violations they've had are incredible. So it's a challenging time, but it's a strategic time for our country to really take things in a new direction, and that's what our committee is designed to do. And it's bipartisan. You don't hear that very often in DC. And there will be different approaches between our parties and different philosophies, but I think there's been an agreement that it's a different world now, and China's gone in a totally different direction. We want to deter them from aggression around the world. And so it's going to be important to keep moving the ball forward. Be happy to talk more about that. Also, just a few things I've been working on, just to give you some background. Some of you may know the Isinga family, but we recently lost Chandra Isinga. She died from a bone graft surgery that was infected with TB. And turns out that there were 36 people who were affected by that around the country. And it turns out the same company that provided that cadaver bone, actually there was an outbreak 3 years ago and people died. And so I'm working on legislation that would hopefully never allow that to happen again. And it's going to take some work, but working on that. Also, many of you, are involved in agriculture or know friends, family who are involved in agriculture. One of the biggest challenges our growers are facing is the cost of labor. And many use, for different, harvest H-2A visas. And the Department of Labor has mandated wage increases every year for the last 10 years. And so now you've got the Department of Labor saying people have to pay $18.50 an hour, plus housing, plus transportation. And I'm hearing from 5th and 6th generation farmers that they may have to go out of business because they cannot afford that. And so then we're kind of left with, okay, are we going to import our food? Are other states going to grow it? But Michigan, we are natural with our Great Lakes and our water supply. We should be leading the country, and food security is national security. And so I'm actually put in a bill that would stop that wage increase and make sure we freeze it for at least 2 years to help our farmers get back on their feet, because I don't want to see our agricultural, strength in Michigan dissipated. And this is a government mandate that is causing this. It's not because our farmers aren't good farmers. It's not because they aren't being efficient and doing a great job. It's because these government mandates are driving up their wages. Another thing, yeah.
Do you know the bill number for the TV bill and
I will get you that. I can never remember the numbers.
I'll look it up.
Yeah. A third bill I've been working on, and I know many of you are very familiar with this, the No-Goshen Act. And by the No-Goshen Act, this is a bill that would prevent companies that are headquartered in nations that are our adversaries. So China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, from getting American taxpayer dollars. The Biden so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which actually increased inflation, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, actually would allow tax credits for green energy production to go to countries where countries are based. And so if you think about it, how often has China subsidized American businesses come over and compete with it? It just wouldn't happen. So I know on our state level, our governor has given hundreds of millions of dollars for this project. I want to try and make sure that we don't allow federal dollars to go there. Now, the challenge is, I will tell you, we've got a lot of support for this on the Republican side. So far, I do not have a Democrat that's willing to sign on to support it. And, Alyssa Slotkin is trying to get in the game. She put in some legislation recently trying to say, well, this wouldn't affect Goshen, but it's good public policy to reform the CFIUS process, which, would require more oversight by the Treasury and the whole committee that reviews things. But it's really kind of too late for Goshen, and it's also something that isn't going to have a major impact. But it's interesting because I feel like the Democrats are starting to realize they have a liability there politically. And so I'm hoping if we can keep the pressure on, more and more would feel responsible of stepping up on this. But we'll see. So far they have not. I want to talk about the appropriations process. And then why don't we, let me just tell you a little bit about the appropriations process, and then let's just open it up for questions. Does that work for everybody? Okay. I serve on the appropriations committee. Our job is to do 12 bills that fund the federal government. And our goal at the beginning of the year was to do what we call regular order. And that is, you introduce the bills, they go through the subcommittee where you have hearings on the bills. Then they go through the full committee where you have amendments, and anyone on the full committee can offer amendments. Once it goes through the full committee, then it goes on the floor where there are also additional amendments. And our goal was to make it a very transparent process where every member could offer amendments on the floor. Now, when you do that, it's very time consuming because you literally get hundreds of amendments that all have to be voted on the floor. So it's really good for transparency, but from a time standpoint, it takes a lot of time. Now, we were actually able to get about 70% of that target in terms of what we were trying to do across the House floor. Then we ran into a bit of a snag because we ended up going through the speaker situation, and it became very divisive. And for 3 weeks, we were kind of dead in the water. And truthfully, the 70% that we got done is probably the easier of the bills. And the next 30% is tougher because you have Democrats going way in one direction, Republicans very much wanting to. So it was more complicated, but at the same time, we were actually doing a circular firing squad on our own Republican team. And so the whole process broke down. Now, at the same time, the Senate not doing anything on this front. I mean, they basically, I don't think they passed a single appropriations bill in the Senate. And so then you have a situation where things aren't getting done, and you start getting deadlines, and then we have what's called a continuing resolution, which basically says, okay, we're just going to keep spending at the status quo until we can get our appropriations bills done that will actually set a new spending plan in place. Well, actually, before McCarthy left, we had a proposal that would have, I think it would have cut spend. There have been so many different proposals, sometimes I forget exactly, but it basically would have cut spending and would have attached HR 2, which is our border security bill, to the legislation. Now, to me, that was a win-win. You're cutting spending and you're putting border security and saying, okay, deal with this, Senate, if you want to. Now, here's where it gets a little complicated, because we have, there's a spectrum of people. There are some people who will never vote for a single appropriations bill. There will some that'll vote for only if it's like a 10% cut. There are some people who will say, well, I'll cut whatever over here, but you cannot touch military spending. And so you got all these different criteria. And then there was one big group that said, we will never vote for a continuing resolution. So we had a plan that would have done this continuing resolution that would have cut spending, would have attached the border security bill, and I think the Senate would have had to support that. But we had many members who said, I will not support a continuing resolution. So that's when we had the McCarthy thing where he said, okay, then let's do this. That's what led to the revolt, the 8 people who, and all the Democrats went along with that. Of course, they were just gleeful. But that's what really kind of cratered our appropriations process. So then we were kind of in a situation where we were going continuing resolution to continuing resolution. Now, the challenge with that is, if you get people who will never vote for a continuing resolution, the only way you keep the government open is to have Democrats support the legislation. So we started going down this road of doing these continuing resolutions. But the problem with continuing resolutions is, if you think about our military, they need to have some ability, some agility to spend for new programs, new innovation, different troop movements, all these different things. If you do a continuing resolution, you're basically saying, we're just going to spend what we did last year on the programs we did last year, whether it adapts to the future or not. And so it really hurts the military, not to mention that, military inflation, what is it, 3, 5, 7, okay, you start doing that, then you start affecting, our troops aren't paid a lot to begin with. And you start saying basically, with inflation the way it is, and with different needs, you're really hurting the military. So then it became a question: as the longer we do these continuing resolutions, the more we're going to hurt our national defense. So Mike Johnson, our new speaker, we finally got to a new speaker. By the way, I sat through 3 weeks of just what we've all been in meetings where everybody's yelling at each other. But about halfway through, I started having all this tooth pain. So I ended up having to get a root canal. It's like everything felt like a root canal at that point. But but we finally got through the process. We got a new speaker, and he made the decision to, we kind of ran into the deadline again, and it's like, okay, let's split up. So we don't do a 12-bill omnibus bill. Let's split it up into different segments. And then time it so that we can actually work on a different time frame. And so, give it like 2 weeks difference. So it isn't like, let's roll it out here and, like Nancy Pelosi used to do, read it in the middle of the night and you go out the next day. So we ended up doing that. But still, we ended up coming to the end of the continuing resolution. And it was kind of at that point where if you do further continuing a resolution, you're really hurting our national defense. But we had to pass appropriations bill. Now, at that point, we were looking at, we didn't want to cut defense, we didn't want to cut veterans. So we made that agreement. It actually led to us cutting other programs for the first time in 10 years. So we cut non-defense, non-VA funding for the first time we've done that in 10 years. So to me, that was pretty significant. Now, in the process, you know, you go through this negotiation between the House, the Senate, and the White House, and you have to come to an agreement to say, okay, what agreement will get enough votes to pass? Now, it got very complicated because there were some on our side who said, okay, unless we cut, you know, I forget what the percentage was, say 10%, I won't support it. Now, I will tell you from a political standpoint, that's a very easy, like, that would be very easy for me to do politically. You know, because I'd go back and I'd tell all my Republican friends, you know, I'm not going to vote for this piece of whatever unless it cuts this amount of spending. But the reality is because we were in the majority, we have to govern. And so if you don't get enough people to vote for a bill, you're going to have a shutdown. And I know there are some who say, let's just shut the place down. And believe me, I get that sentiment. I mean, there are a lot of bureaucracies that I'd like to see shut down. The problem is when you shut down government, you actually are just accruing costs. You know, you're going to have to pay that money back, and it actually costs more money to open it back up. So it's not really a good solution. And the other thing is, and I think we all know this, if Republicans are anywhere near a government shutdown, does the media blame the Democrats? Have you ever seen, I've never in a government shutdown seen the media blame the Democrats. It's always the Republicans. And so when you think about going into this next election cycle, when we have a chance to elect a Republican president, hopefully a Republican senator from Michigan, hopefully get us, you know, we've got like a 1-vote majority in the House right now, which makes it very difficult to govern. Did we want our message to be, yeah, we shut down the government? And then the other question is, okay, what policy agreement would there be at that point that would get the government back open? In my experience, every time the government shuts down, we come back and it's a worse situation for us because we've had to get, you know, people who won't vote for reopening, and then you end up having to get more. So it was kind of a lose-lose situation. And I feel when at the end of the day, and just an overview of our spending, about 2/3 of the spending is on autopilot in our federal government. So we think of things like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, interest on the debt. I mean, this stuff, Congress doesn't say, okay, we're not going to pay Medicare today, or Social Security. We don't say we're not going to pay our interest on the debt. So 1/3 of it, we actually have control of. So that's what we do in the appropriations process. Now some of that, like in this appropriations process, 70% of that was for the military and VA. So you say, okay, well, I'm all for cutting spending, but right now the world is not a safe place. I mean, when you look at the conflicts around the world, when you look at what China, and this is something I'm getting more and more aware of, is when you look at what they're building in terms of their military, this is not the time to be cutting back on our military. So, as I said earlier, this was the first time in 10 years that we actually cut non-defense, non-defense. We also made sure we weren't funding the additional IRS agents that the Biden administration wanted to do. In the House version, we actually worked very closely and were able to defund the World Health Organization. And believe me, that is an ongoing project, and you've been great helping me understand kind of everything WHO is doing. But again, that wasn't something that the Democrats were willing to do, and you got to kind of gauge what are you ready to shut the government down for. And so yeah, go ahead.
That WHO thing, wasn't it just one like committee or department of the WHO that was being defunded? It wasn't the entire WHO.
Well, we've had I'm a co-sponsor of a number of bills. One would completely pull us out of the World Health Organization.
I remember that one.
And one, the other one, I'm trying to think of the other one.
I thought I remembered reading it, and it was like one department or something of the sort of the WHO that was going to be defunded. It wasn't the entire organization.
We actually.
I know
there's
the
two.
one that
Yeah,
you're talking about.
I'm mixing the two up because in appropriations we defunded this, and the bill would actually pull us out of them.
Yeah.
Because they have a system where you're kind of you're kind of given an assessment by country, and to me, I think and just recently, the head of the World Health Organization was chastising Israel and didn't say a word about Hamas using a hospital to launch attacks and to harbor terrorists, and they're criticizing Israel for. So I mean, it's but those are the things. Just to get back to kind of that original idea of the 12 bills with oversight, and if we had the ability to pass these bills, it would give us so much more leverage with the Senate and in negotiations. But when we had the meltdown and kind of took all our momentum away, and then at the end of the day, you say, well, that's not nearly what I would have liked to have negotiated or seen. But at that point, we were kind of not viewed credibly because we had gone through all the debacle with the speaker and everything. So it really weakened our hand, in my opinion. And I tend to view these things and try and understand it each time through. So you're never going to hear me say, I will never vote for a continuing resolution. Because that simply, what that does is says, okay, if we're in a situation where we need to do a continuing resolution, that's immediately I'm a no vote. And in order to get the votes, do I want the Democrats to be supplying votes? And if they are the ones supplying the votes, what are they going to extract for an agreement? And so, I try and be discerning on these things where, believe me, I don't like governing by continuing resolution. That, I served on the Appropriations Committee because I want to prioritize and cut spending and make sure we're spending on the things we should and not on the things we don't. But our process isn't working the way it should. And I think, we're just going to have to keep, hopefully doing it better this time. But some of these challenges still remain. So
there's a lot of people that are really upset with me because of some of the things that were in that appropriations bill. Like, there's gun control and there's Planned Parenthood funding. Am I correct in that?
Well, so let me just say this. There are funds in that bill that go to different things. There is a prohibition on any funds being used for abortion. So it's called the Hyde Amendment. And we were actually able to keep that. And when you think the Democrats, their number one priority right now is abortion, promoting abortion, that's their big political issue. Let's promote abortion. We were able to keep the Hyde Amendment. And that prohibits government funds funds from you. Now, do funds, family planning, go to organizations like Planned Parenthood? And are those funds, do they find ways, I'm not saying it's perfect by any stretch, but by law, they are not permitted to use taxpayer dollars for abortion. And then one other thing on the gun. So just so you're aware, because I know there's different gun groups. The NRA has been pretty solid on these issues from my standpoint. Like if they're opposed to something and tell me why, it usually makes sense. So they did not oppose this legislation. So what it tells me is some of the concerns people were raising it was not a new policy or a new program or something that would promote gun control. It may have been funding programs that people think, well, this could lead to gun control down the road. And there's always sort of that slippery slope argument. There was nothing in that bill that was gun control. And now, do I get irritated when they want to fund gun research at CDC or something like that? Do I push back against that? Absolutely. But I think it's misrepresenting. There have been people out there who said, well, it's gun control, promoted abortion, and all this stuff. That just isn't true.
Well, there's $25 million in funding, is my understanding. So correct me if I'm wrong, but there's firearm retirement age for senior citizens, safety checks for like invasion of privacy to look for guns in pregnant women's homes.
Yeah, I don't.
Studying the effectiveness of gun confiscations, I assume that's maybe the CDC aspect, I don't know. And studies on mandatory waiting periods, expanded background checks.
Yeah, I would really ask the question, and this is where I'm not an expert on gun policy, but I do trust the NRA. And if they didn't come out, I've had 100% record with the NRA. And if they came out and said to me, hey, we have concerns about this, I'd be zeroed in on that. They did not in any way oppose the bill. Yeah.
Did you read the bill?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you haven't mentioned our border once yet, but in the bill, there's plenty of funding for how many countries? It was Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Oman, Tunisia. Why are we protecting those citizens and not our own?
Yeah. Well, those are two different issues, but we did actually put in funding for, I think it was 22,000 border agents, which is the highest it's ever been. So we did negotiate that. Did it go as far as I'd like? Absolutely not. But we also got more detention beds. So right now, when people come across the border, they interdict them, they give them, all sorts of stuff, and basically say, hey, show up in a few years for a court date. Well, we know that never happens, and they disappear, right? But by getting more border agents, by getting more detention beds, more technology on the border, at least it helps our border agents do the job that they swore to do. Now, is it going to get fixed until we have a new president? No. I mean, it is the only way we're going to fix that is with a new president. Everything we can do up to that and negotiate to help improve the situation for the next president, I want to make sure we do that. But, it doesn't go as far as I would have liked, but absolutely, it's an improvement. Not as much as I'd like. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier about defense and how important it is. And as a veteran, I agree with you. However, there's two charges that you were charged with as legislator, by the Constitution. That is national defense and commerce. You mentioned a part of it, but at the same time, on the defensive side, I hear nothing about it. You mentioned a little bit, but right now, we fund, I don't know what the budget is for our contribution to the United Nations, Well, we said here, the United Nations does nothing down at that border, nothing.
Yeah.
And even in the other countries, does nothing. So I have a problem us funding the United Nations, and you're talking about defense, here we are violating that right now. We're doing nothing to stop that. Today alone, if you look at what's on the news today across immigration, it's terrible. And even in our own state, a lady got killed in Grand Rapids by illegal. And this is going on. And how are we, a citizen, a judge ruled in Illinois that it's okay for illegals, and whether you call them illegals or not, I don't care, they're not here, to allow them to carry a gun. The other thing is, that's criminal. That's called aiding and abetting. Anybody that votes for that, including you or whoever, that voted for it should be held to the same thing as that criminal that occurred, that did the offense. If we stop there, we can stop this. Because here we're not on the border, but yet we're affected. When our governor does what she does and gets support from the White House and other members of the Democratic side, what are we to do? We shoot them first and that? We don't know. I'm an old guy. Well, how do I know that person coming there might be carrying a gun?
Yeah.
So you get what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. So just so I was with President Trump earlier this week in Grand Rapids,
right?
And we had a roundtable with sheriffs and talking about how every county, every state is now a border state.
That's correct.
And we talked about the fentanyl that's coming in from the southern border. We talked about, obviously the violence. And I have to say, he's absolutely committed to this, and I've never seen so many sheriffs who are fully engaged in wanting to make sure, because in the past it was always sort of, well, okay, that's a federal issue down there. But like you said, now that, people, it's 5,000 people a day. We've had 8 million since Biden took office. 8 million have come here illegally into our country. And we have over 300 documented that have been on the terrorist watch list. I think it's 340. 20,000 from China. So I absolutely agree with you. This is our number one priority. But the question is, in a divided government, right now we have limits on what we can get done on this. Everything we can do is keep focusing the public on the issue,
right,
and keep working to make improvements where we can. But it's going to take presidential leadership.
But our government is working against us, and that's how I feel. I feel and I know two of the sheriffs really well that were down at the border.
Yeah.
And I agree with you. Mason County, Kim Cole,
Yeah.
and ours with Craig Mass. Exactly.
Yeah.
They saw it firsthand. And,
Yeah.
and if you ever saw their video, I guarantee you,
Yeah.
it'll bring tears to your eyes because of what's going on. So.
No, I've been down there.
Yeah.
I've talked with the border agents. I'll tell you what they told me. I was on these boats that are about as fast as you can imagine. These are really impressive boats. And I said, well, you got to be able to catch anyone you're going after, This is amazing. He said, well, here's what happens. They'll be coming across in a raft. They'll see us coming. They'll start throwing children overboard because they know we will rescue the children, and then they get away. So
this is nonpartisan. This is like humanitarian. This is just, it shouldn't be divided Democrats and Republicans. I don't understand how.
Well, and part of it, and this is where I think it's really important that we communicate clearly on this, because I think to your point, it is a humanitarian crisis. Women and children are being abused.
Mm-hmm.
We're enriching the drug cartels, $10,000 a person coming across, and then they keep their hooks into them, even when they're here. When we phrase it that way, I think people get it, and because what the Democrats try and do is say, well, you're against, people from other countries. You're xenophobic, or what, and it couldn't be further from the truth, but sometimes we have to communicate in a way that really elevates what's happening, just the tragedies going on with, families. I mean, human trafficking, the fentanyl that's coming across. I mean, and this is another thing I've learned is, China is making the precursors of the fentanyl that's coming across our southern border. And then the drug cartels figure out ways to manufacture it. And the other thing I learned from the sheriffs the other day was that, we used to have this huge problem with meth, where people, would be cooking meth in their home, the home would blow up, or, just some wild things happening to people. Well, now they aren't doing that anymore here, which is good. It's cheaper to get it from Mexico because they're manufacturing it there and getting it easily across our southern border. And so the meth problem hasn't disappeared. It's just now they've got a new, and the cartels are doing this, and so I totally get, when it comes to spending, at the end of the day, this is the thing, 34 trillion. This is the thing that I believe is the existential threat for our country. The way to get to that, though, it's something that we're going to have to create a will to address some of the mandatory spending. And by that, what do I mean? First person that ever comes out and says, well, I want to change Social Security, get their head cut off, right? What we need to do is say, how can we reform different programs in a way so they're actually there in the future and also save money in the long run? And how do we structure that? We also have to grow our economy. And that's where things like what Biden's doing is, with our natural gas, our energy, our natural resources, the things that have made this country so strong, him basically attacking these economic engines, it discourages growth. And that's another way to get at, the debt. But yeah, okay.
I feel the whole thing is about their one world global order.
Yeah.
Bottom line.
Yeah.
They create a much chaos, send billions of people in here, probably a few years ago, several years ago, probably have 40 million that are in there. But when I see and I'm reading, 1 million acres in Texas are burned up and a lot of beef cattle are killed and exported and PCP owns many processing plants,
Yeah. Yeah.
and you all probably know I'm watching, but in the meantime, we're gonna be having to fend for ourselves because these people coming in now are very dangerous. They've got guns, and from my reading, there's 120,000 Chinese boots on the ground already, and a lot of these are single men, and they're headed over to Utah to the Sam's grape shooting. So, I mean, they have no way to get us except from within. And this is what they're doing, folks. I mean, it's one world global order.
Be careful, she has her carry permit and.
Good job.
Be careful.
You guys, we educate each other.
Yes.
We don't want to hear he's explaining what's happening, but we've got to back our backs. Because Brian probably thinks I'm crazy. I saw two ladies walking down South Stone Road. What are they doing? We're close to the border. Are we going to be close to Texas?
What do you mean close to the border? Chuck was saying every state is a border state. We're already a border state.
Yeah.
I mean,
I
30
agree.
years ago, when I snowmobiled to Drummond Island, you can shoot across to Canada. You just sign a book that you were there or whatever, and then you come back. I don't know what they do anymore up there, but you could sneak across the Canadian border so easily.
Well, that's the other thing, I went and talked with the border agents at the Sioux, and they've talked about how their resources are diminished because they're trying to help the southern border, but then that leaves our northern border. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to speak more, Spencer, about the conditions in the country than about anything.
Yeah.
Just, there are so many things, they're all negative. You talked about taking out the funding for our border we were trying to get that passed. I don't think anybody in here would trust Biden's regime to spend the money that you appropriate on the board to do anything good with it anyway.
Yeah.
He's taken our oil reserves for strategic defense. We now have one, he's not going to back up.
Yeah.
They're, you know, we're basically defenseless because we have no strategic oil reserves. We're spending money, giving it to, Israel for defense, for bombs, and then money to fight Hamas. We're sending money to Hamas for humanitarian aid. So we're funding both.
So one highlight too, I just want to tell you, we eliminated the funding for the UNRWA, United Nations funding that was supporting Hamas. We found out, you know, that reports we learned where they were actually collaborating with Hamas. And so in our bill, we cut off their funding. So, but anyway, so that, yeah.
And you know what he's doing now? He's getting to his burden. He's a land-based thing that not been practiced today or yesterday. You know, ceasefire, well, doesn't keep his own people be off his back, but, I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, no, he's undermining Netanyahu.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm just, this is a question to see if, we know that all of this debt that our country has is absolutely sustainable. It's terrible, it's a terrible thing we have. So, is there any conversation behind the scenes to the fact that I know, you know, you hear things, this and that, this much money was given for things that have nothing to do with national defense or things like that, but I think would just be considered silly things, studies about silly things, things that could go private sector that we are funding. Why? If we feel that so much of that, you know, to try to, someday we're gonna have to look at this debt. So is there any kind of talk going on among solid thinking people?
Yeah, well, and this will give you a little snapshot of, you know, kind of the interesting discussions you have, because Bill Huizenga, some of you know him because he had represented the area. You know, he has a proposal on a debt commission where it would have to be bipartisan, but the idea that you look at the drivers of the debt, you try and figure out what, you know, solutions there could be, kind of force an up and down vote on, you know, some kind of a spending reduction. Now, that seemed reasonable to me, and I met with some friends from Freedom Works, and you know, they shared with me kind of their support for it, and I thought, well, that sounds good. So I was going to sign on to it, and I did sign on to it. But then I heard from my friends at Americans for Prosperity that no, they don't like that approach, because they feel like it's sort of a Trojan horse toward a tax increase, where you get the Democrats involved, that they're, you know, Republicans will say cut spending, Democrats are going to say raise taxes, and they're worried that you could actually get a tax increase. So the challenge is, in a divided government, you have to have sort of both parties involved. And so that's what, so this stuff, like what you and I mean, we could go through that spending, and we could eliminate this, and then we'd sit over here with these guys who want to increase the things we just eliminate, you know, and it just makes it very hard to negotiate that process. So I totally agree. You know, one of the things I experienced when I was in the state legislature, and where we finally got our fiscal house in order, and we started off using something called the price of government. It was like kind of that zero-based budgeting thing where you basically start at ground zero and say, okay, if you're going to spend something, you're buying something. Well, what are you buying with this spending? Or what do you know, kind of this idea that everything gets scrutinized. That's really what we need to do. We can do that at the subcommittee level and appropriations, but to get it across the floor and to get it signed into law, we need to have our whole team on board. And right now, we just have such a slim majority that if two people don't like what the rest of the group came up with, we're done, you know, it's so, but that's the goal. The subcommittees kind of going through it line item by line item, eliminating programs, eliminating wasteful spending, getting it to the full committee, fighting off the amendments that the Democrats try and add spending on, doing the same thing on the floor, and then negotiating firmly with the Senate. But I'll tell you, it sure helps to have some more Republicans in both the House and the Senate, and then of course in the White House. But, yeah.
On that note, you've got a lot of Republican congressmen that are saying they're stepping down,
Yeah,
and some of them are like, I think it was Mike Gallagher.
Yeah.
That was saying he's gonna step down on this date, and that date happens to be like, if you step down on that date or any later, then you can't hold a special election in that district to get another person in office to represent that district.
yeah.
So is there any talk of like, I don't know, pulling these people out of office now? If they're saying they're resigning,
Yeah.
get them out of office.
Yeah, no,
Is there any
it
talk
was,
of that?
so, and I've known Mike over the years, he's been the chairman of our committee.
He
He's done
sounds
a lot
like
of
a
good
dud.
work. But the way he's approached this, I do not understand kind of how he's approached this. I was surprised. Quite frankly, I learned about it on, you know, I took off from DC, landed in Detroit. My phone was blowing up, you know, and it was just kind of a shock for all of it. The challenge is you have 435 autonomous actors who all do what they want. I mean, leadership has some
Or
leverage.
they're getting something, they're getting some money at the table.
Yeah,
Is
but
there
I,
some reward somehow they could?
yeah, I totally do not understand why he timed it the way he did. Yeah, I was
the Republican caucus come together and make him resign today?
You know, that's a good question. You know, to force it,
Right.
it would have to be an expulsion.
Cause what's that date that he?
Yeah, and I-
don't know.
Sometime this
Yeah,
month.
that's what I thought.
Yeah.
Because we're gonna get to the point where Hakeem Jeffries is gonna be in charge of.
Right. No, I know. I know. No, that's a good question. I'll find out if there is something we could do to kind of make sure we could, you know, have a Republican in that spot.
Like, get them out of office, you're leaving, okay, bye-bye.
Okay,
And
well,
hold that special election.
He kind of screwed
And
over
Buck
his
did the
district
same
as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of them, there's a whole
Yeah.
bunch of them.
And they're doing it in cahoots because they're anti-Trumpers.
Yeah, this whole resigning, I mean, if there's some family emergency or something,
Right.
like Chris Stewart, you know, his wife has, I want to say dementia or Parkinson's. I got why he resigned when he did, but these other ones, whether it's another job or other things,
Or a payout on the backside.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
I came out of corporate America and I would never allow this to occur like what I see in government. I'm not talking about you specifically, I'm talking about the system. First of all, you have two charges. Your charges are defense and commerce. Those are the two things by constitution, right? That's primary. With that, then you funnel it down in terms of what our priority is going to be. They should all be focused on those two functions because that is the only charges that you're given by the Constitution. If you look at it, it's true. So why would you cascade those down so that every bill that comes up is either one or the other? In corporate, we have KPIs, we have key performance measures, right, or indicators. We do that to be able to assess are we on target or not.
Yeah.
I would never, ever, as a vice president, ever get allowed doing what you guys do as a whole. Because I would be accountable, I'd probably be out the door, I'd be fired. And that's why I don't understand, what are the priorities of Congress? You know what I mean? Not pointing at you, but as a whole.
Totally get what you're saying.
Yeah,
And-
okay.
And I wish Congress did operate more like a business. And believe me, in business, when people report to you, that you're able to kind of accomplish those objectives. The challenge is, in Congress, you have this dispersion of power where, you know, like, I can say one thing, Hakeem Jeffries may have a different opinion. Rashida Tlaib has a different opinion. And you're somehow supposed to work as a group to get something done. And that's where majorities make a difference. So the greater our majority is, the more we have that objectives, let's meet our objectives, let's limit spending here, let's So the stronger the majority is, the better.
If I may add to that, in Macomb County, they put up a charter. They're actually very effective what they did. Rick Staffakis is the supervisor there and did an excellent job. It's the first county or first township I've ever seen where they put up their charter and live by it. It's kind of interesting. And so we think that government and business can operate similar. Well, we can't totally, but there are some steps we can move to get there. And so I just say that to you because I've seen them operate. I've been there several times, and they do a great job.
Yeah. Well, when we had, I think the lesson I learned from 2015 is to prepare for a majority working with a Republican House, a Senate, and a president. Because from day one, you receive tremendous opposition, but you're able to accomplish things. So, we ended up spending a lot of political capital on Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which actually helped the country. We missed out on repealing and replacing Obamacare by one vote, John McCain, unfortunately. And, but I would say in that setting, we were kind of surprised. We didn't know Donald Trump was going to win. And I feel like we had an agenda, but we didn't really think that could all happen. This time, I think we could have a Republican president, Donald Trump, and a Republican Senate. And I think we need to be prepared on how we're going to govern. And I think appropriations has to do what you were saying. I think our policies have to be crisp, and we can't allow kind of our own small disagreements to get in the way of actually accomplishing big things for the country. And so that's the lesson I'm kind of taking from that. Yes?
Could you speak to the pandemic agreement?
The
pandemic agreement that they're trying to make everyone.
I'm gonna ask my expert right here to speak to that.
So the Sovereignty Coalition, if you don't follow it, you should. It's sovereigntycoalition.org. It is a collaboration, a coalition of about 80 organizations around the country that their leadership is working collaboratively to get us to either slow down, stop the amendments that are scheduled to take place this next May, basically 50 days from now. You'll see we have a countdown on the website now as to when that is likely to take place. Most of what is going to be voted on isn't even able to be read at this time. It is being negotiated behind closed doors, but we would think that this is being led by organizations and leaders from around the world, right? Third world leaders. You'd think it would be people like Tedros, who is a communist, but it isn't. It is being led and directed by this administration. This administration and our Health and Human Services Department are funding the World Health Organization. Bill Gates is a big funder of the World Health Organization. There are a lot of private entities, and their ultimate goal is looking at, first of all, the example of what happened during COVID, and that was the ability under an emergency declaration to control all aspects of our life. They're going to basically utilize this, and it's scheduled right now. What was done in the dark of night, if you will, is an NDAA agreement was signed and put into place by Biden in 2022.
What did you say?
NDAA, yeah, that agreement was basically was a funding mechanism that was done, which pretty much gave the money and the authority to go forward with the World Health Organization and its future with federal tax dollars. And so we've already agreed to the funding for the next 5 years, giving over $1 billion a year. We've actually combined put in about $5 billion a year into the World Health Organization. And what they're planning right now is a workaround to the U.S. Constitution. The workaround, well, it's happening. It is absolutely happening. And if we do not take steps in the near future, now we have a certain amount of time to opt out. Normally, this would be a treaty, which means it would go through the Senate. Ron Johnson attempted to pass a bill, and it went through the Senate to make sure that whatever happened in these agreements would be treated as a treaty. They're now calling it an agreement and an accord. which to get around the treaty's mechanism, the Senate at any time can step in, which is
By the way,
really.
that was, well, I couldn't remember exactly what it did. But
So that bill would have made any agreement being treated as a treaty. The good news is every Republican voted that it would be a treaty, 47. But every Democrat voted against it being a treaty, 49. And so it can be revisited at any time, but that was the first step. So it already is there. We know the courts are not going to save us because we witnessed it during COVID. We have entered into this agreement to allow these things to take place. They are using the China model. The China model is treating everything as equal. It is the environment, climate change, gun violence, anything they determine to be an emergency of, it doesn't have to be, as we say, pandemic X, if you will, which they are already claiming is going to happen. But they are basically, if these agreements pass, now the good news is it is countries like Russia, countries like Yugoslavia or Croatia and others who are actually now fighting against the passage of these agreements. And so we have to hope that there are enough pushback that they can delay the passage of these amendments, because even though they won't take place for a period of months, the funding of this through our own HHS will begin to take place. Anything that happens, the emergency declarations will be declared by one person only, and that is Tedros himself. We are giving him ultimate authority over all things in regard to this, which means that Tedros, and so he will be the next person that will determine when an emergency takes place and what it is that we're going to do to react to it.
So I got to apologize. I have to go to a dinner in Midland tonight, so I've got a little bit of a drive. I appreciate you making the time. And you've got an expert right here on the Rural Health Organization. You probably didn't necessarily want that calling into work, but you're doing it. So thank you.
Thank you for making it this far. Feel free to hit that like and subscribe button.